morning. My name is Yesenia Reyes, and it is a real pleasure to be with you here today. And to our panelists, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. To Rachel, my cohort in this endeavor to give this session this morning, and to our help behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, a big thank you. And to all of you for making an investment of time and and energy into the calling that you have been asked to step into, right, which is executive sponsorship. And so in the spirit of the discussion this morning, which gosh, just in a short hour, I think I can go home now. I think I've learned everything I needed to learn about being an executive sponsor. We certainly do have exciting times ahead of us in terms of the things that are happening, the Internet of Things, the digital disruption, the expectations of our changing constituencies, that we have an opportunity to be, in service, kind of in a time that is allowing us to do it in so many different innovative and creative ways. And so the thing that we want to talk about in here, the topic, the enablement that we want to give you is, as a sponsor, how do you navigate this constantly changing environment? And we hope to give you the key takeaways, and also kind of in that, I was excited just to hear the language up there, to be architects of the future, right? To be the courageous leaders, to be the ones that have the opportunity to see kind of the new way of doing the work that matters in California. So thank you so much for being here. We have a distinguished panel with us that we would like to welcome. Leslie Gaffney, the Assistant Deputy Director for the Center of Family Health in the California Department of Public Health. Thank you. Sharon, Hilliard, the Chief Deputy Director for the California Employment Development Department. Kathy Conrad, the Accenture Director for Digital Government in our Federal Services. And Andrew Roth, Benefits and Service Executive Officer for CalSTRS. We also have Rachel Frey here from Deloitte. Rachel, stand up and take your bow. Principal at Deloitte Consulting, and once again, Yesenia Reyes, also Managing Director at Accenture. So the morning is going to be structured in some key parts. One being the characteristics, right? As a sponsor, what should we be kind of thinking the profile is, the characteristics of an executive sponsor, the differences between those that are going to manage the project day to day and those that are going to sponsor the projects, kind of what we can expect during those phases of project startup all the way through close. What does sponsorship look like in this new agile world? Again, we want to listen to our insights and experiences from our panel, and then do our session wrap up. Any questions about how we're going to navigate the morning? All right, well, we will get started. Rachel.
So we're looking for this to be a pretty interactive morning, so there will be audience participation required. And unlike this morning, where John had talked about keeping your cell phones away, we're actually going to ask you to take them out a little bit to have this be an interactive session. But since it is a smaller group, would love to have some people actually share some of their ideas and stories with us as well. So what we wanted to talk through is just a couple of things first. I'm going to ask you to take out your cell phones. We wanted to get an idea of who is in the room today. So what we'd like to understand first is how many projects you have actually served as an executive sponsor, just to get an idea. And the panel members could participate too if you would like, to. And you're going to text the keyword, you're going to text a keyword either 1exec, 24exec, 510exec, not yet, to 37607. And we're expecting that we're going to have a range of individuals that have been in various roles around executive sponsorship in this session. Okay, so we've got a couple of folks in the room, it looks like, that have not yet been an executive sponsor, one that has. Anybody having any issues with the polling? Pretty simple, we're going to use it throughout the session. Okay, it looks like for the most part in the room that we are in a position where looks like maybe newer to executive sponsorship. Let's get also a little bit of an idea as well about how big those projects are, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today is a little bit whether or not size matters and some other considerations relative to executive sponsorship. So also text in, similar to the one before, text in the keyword, so either 2 mil, 10 mil, 30 mil, or more than 30 to 37607, the size of the project for which you've been an executive sponsor. It's California, everything is big. There's very few that are under $2 million in California. Couple of them, it looks like. But most of them are larger, looks like between 10 and maybe more than 30 million as it relates to sponsorship. So that gives us a little bit of an idea. Our distinguished panel have been on varying ranges in the course of their career in terms of big and small and high visibility, regulatory impacts, and a lot of the topics this morning that we heard from the ambassador around disruption, and we're going to have them share a little bit of their stories this morning. But wanted to also understand a little bit around when you think of an executive sponsor, what is it that you actually think an executive sponsor should do in their role? I would say it's the one role that probably is the most ill-defined or ill-prepared. And I love the quote. I took the quote this morning from the ambassador about there's a lot of things for which you train that will never happen, and there are a lot of things which you will never train that are going to happen in conflict. And I think in the role of an executive sponsor, that is probably more true than any other role. There's not really a training or someone coming to you and saying, here's exactly what you need to do as an executive sponsor. We're hoping that today, through the course of this session, that will give you some ideas. But it looks like the majority of folks are saying that they should set the direction. A couple of folks said build consensus, serve as the primary point of contact with stakeholders, may serve as the decision maker or lead the project. These are just some examples of what those particular characteristics or qualities that somebody may end up having to see. Just by a show of hands, how many things is probably a combination of the items on there, and you had a hard time picking one? Okay, and that's what we were trying to get at is it's not really one role as an executive sponsor. And what we wanted to distinguish a little bit between is what are some other ideas, maybe you can just type in a free form, of some other words that come up as characteristics. When you think of an executive sponsor, whether in what you see yourself or someone that has been a really good executive sponsor, what do you see in that person in terms of a characteristic? What are some keywords? And I'll tell you the ones that what we've seen, we actually went out and did quite a bit of research to see what the common words are, and I'd love to see how they actually, how they compare relative to what we've seen based off of the research. But common words that we end up seeing are things like engaged, that they need to be motivational, that they need to be visible, that they need to be trusted. See, somebody had said they need to inspire. What else do you see maybe as something that may be words that you would most commonly see? Team, support, inspire, other words. What about securing of resources or funding or other types of support required? Leader is another one. I thought that was really interesting this morning that we had heard from the ambassador. She said, you don't necessarily lead, it's not about you, which I thought I've never actually looked at as a leadership that way because they're always teaching us leadership characteristics. But this morning she said it's about how you bring others and actually how you're able to bring a coalition together and lead others. It's not about you individually being the one out in front all the time. And I thought that was a really interesting takeaway from this morning. The other one I love in here is decisive. It sounded like the ambassador is extremely decisive, maybe unlike her husband, but she's very decisive, and that's what a lot of people are looking for too, is someone that can come very quickly and bring resolution to a matter and not let it languish. Consensus building, the term I learned, over the course of the last couple of weeks speaking with the ambassador is about, she uses the term coalition building. It's more, within the international world. Championing, dealing with risks, being curious, making decisions, building, navigating, team player, decision maker. Those are all great words.
It looks like the ones that are coming out as more prevalent are leader and champion, and those are definitely things that we're gonna end up talking about today. Okay, I wanted to just quickly mention the role of, let me go here real quick. The difference between an executive sponsor, a project manager, and a project sponsor. Just curious, by I would say a show of hands, do you think it's really clear to the individuals that are on your projects the distinction between a sponsor, whether they're an executive sponsor, a project sponsor, or a project manager? Do you think it's really clear? Why do you think, how do you think it helps for it to be really clear?
Well, the project manager is day-to-day involved and has a particular role and a set of duties in terms of the activities to drive the project forward, whereas the sponsor, either sponsor, is in more of a strategic role versus that tactical project manager role.
Okay.
So,
Other thoughts from folks in the audience about the difference? Is it clear about the difference between an executive sponsor and a project sponsor? Or is that one maybe a little bit more nuanced? Think about a lot of times, and I'm curious, I'm gonna maybe ask the panel a little bit here as well, in terms of executive committees. One of the things that we've been hearing from individuals is sometimes there is a group that is formed to serve an executive committee. I'm just curious maybe from the panel about, have you had executive committees and how have they been formed? And I don't know, Leslie, if you maybe want to talk about that first.
Sure. So we called ours the steering committee. So
Okay.
it was the executive sponsor, the project sponsor, the project manager, an attorney, a few other key, limited, very small. That was one of the issues is if it grows too large, you get nothing done. So very important to keep it very focused, very high level, all dashboard driven, risk mitigation. Those were the topics that we dealt with. We didn't get down into the weeds, and it was strategically chosen individuals, nobody who, other than the project manager, who sat in on the day-to-day meetings.
Okay. And just by, I would say, order of sequencing, was the committee formed first before the sponsor was defined, or did the sponsor identify who actually would serve in the committee?
The sponsor defined it, I
Okay.
would say.
Brilliant. I'm glad that you actually brought that up because I would say.
It's been a while.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to bring that one up in particular is a lot of times on our engagements, we do have steering committees. And the steering committees represent members that are assisting from the project management, or it could be the project sponsor or the executive sponsor that sits in that committee that ultimately will help with dealing with issues. But there had been a question that we had been discussing quite a bit of, well, what if I have multiple sponsors that sit within that committee? And so it was a question that had been posed of, well, how is there, how could you have multiple sponsors? Because ultimately, there should be one and only one sponsor that really is representative. So I'm just curious if you've had multiple sponsors also that sit within that committee, and how that has, maybe Andrew, since you shook your head, I'm gonna ask you the question. How has that been delineated in terms of governance when you have multiple sponsors within a committee?
So the multiple sponsor issue for us has been somewhat of a governance opportunity because I came into my role a year and a half ago. The project has been on the ground for 3 years, and so the other co-sponsor is our Chief Technology Officer. And so there is sometimes a blurring of lines in terms of responsibility and accountability. I mean, ultimately we have to spend a lot of time together on a daily basis, making sure that we're both in the same place with regards to what the next steps forward are. And sometimes there's a little confusion as to who goes to whom, but communication is really the key for resolving any of those kinds of issues. It does make for a little bit more of a fuzzy governance structure. That is something that our oversight continues to sort of identify as an opportunity for us to get a little bit more clarity on. However, just having the sponsor be the Chief Technology Officer and not having the business represented on the project was not an option. So we're kind of making do as best we can with a little bit of gray.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think it does, you know, yeah, go ahead. Question in the back? No, go ahead.
I would say in our organization, we have a mention of a project director, and it seems like you define it as a project sponsor, actually has many of the same responsibilities as a project director, and the other things under project sponsor are typically related to project manager, creating project charter, etc. But can you comment on how you would distinguish a project sponsor versus a project director?
The project sponsor versus the project director. In some instances, well, I would say sometimes it depends on size of the project, usually, whether or not we've actually had a project director that's been engaged. From a project sponsorship perspective, that person usually is not allocated a very large percentage to the project throughout. It is a secondary role. They usually will have a full-time job. And typically, I would say on the engagements that we've delivered and the ones that we've seen, and also in some of the best practices, project directors tend to more so be allocated a much higher percentage and have more delivery responsibility for a project day to day. Whereas a sponsor is a little bit more involved in dealing with escalation dealing with the resolution of issues that get escalated to them. They're involved in making sure that they're securing funding. But it's usually the percentage of allocation that we tend to see is quite a bit different. Quite a bit different. I see some nods, I see some, has anyone had any other experience with that around project director versus project sponsor? No? Okay. Yes?
I would just say my experience is that the project sponsor and the executive sponsor are generally from the program or from the business side of the house
Yeah.
versus IT. And the project manager or project director is really in charge of the day-to-day operations of the project.
Yes, yeah, and I would say that that is most often would be the case usually is that the projects that that have a business bend to them are usually coming from somebody on the program or the business side of the house would probably be more often than not. What about in the instances where it's a pure technology project where it's maybe a system upgrade? Have you had instances where there would be sponsors that maybe are from the technology side? Yes? Yes, yeah. So I think it depends at times on the scope of the actual project or the program. The scope of the project or program may end up defining who becomes in that role. So maybe one last thing I wanted to ask the audience before we get into the session is just some thoughts on how executive sponsors end up getting assigned. How do you identify who is going to be the executive sponsor? I don't know, Andrew, if you have thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll just say, you know, for our project at CalSTRS, it was a function of who's over, you know, who's most impacted. And since we're replacing our pension administration system, that's the business, and as the benefits and services executive officer, I was identified as a sponsor. My predecessor, before she retired, was also the sponsor for that very reason.
Okay. Sharon, any differences, or is that the same way that they're identified at EDD?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on the impact on the program. For us, though, because our programs tend to intertwine with each other, and we'll have multiple sponsors from multiple program branches, along with our IT deputy and myself as the chief deputy director. Given the size and complexity of our department, and we always have probably 3 or 4 or 5 projects going at any one time. A lot of times due to legislation and changes, so you know, we have a number of resources we've got to keep active and cover all bases. So
Okay, okay, great. So we're going to move now into walking everyone through essentially the phases that a project may go through. And this is from the very beginning of the inception of the project, where we're initiating and coming up with the idea, all the way through to transitioning and closing out that particular project. And we're going to run you through some disruptive scenarios and engage both you and also the panel in sharing their perspectives as they've gone through the various stages of the life cycle about the role, again, of the executive sponsor, and not just the role of the executive sponsor, but what the executive sponsor anticipates should end up happening in terms of engagement from their project manager. Okay? All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Brian. And, oh, actually, I'm going to go to Steve first. And Steve and Brian are going to facilitate the next portion.
Yep.
There you go.
Thanks. So what we wanted to do was to first talk about the project initiation, right? So this is in some ways sort of the reason you came into the public sector, right? You want to get stuff done. You have an idea. How are you going to improve outcomes for those that your agency serves? And thank you. Oh, you want me to move this way? Sorry about that. So you've identified a business need because you're coming from that business side of the perspective. You need to modernize a system or initiate a new system. And costs are maybe too high, something that's driving it, right? And you've brought that idea forward, maybe to a group of your fellow executives, and someone's saying, "Yep, we want to move this idea forward." So the question we first want to play to is that one of the issues that's come up in the discussions is, are we challenging executive sponsors to invest their time, enough of their time, in that role? So the first question we want you to think about, it's a little worded a little differently than it's on the screen. To what degree, how much of your time do you think you should be, if you're an executive sponsor, in this project initiation phase? And panelists want to think about as you're thinking back on your experience as an executive sponsor, maybe what you did, maybe what you now reflect on, maybe you should be doing. How much of your time do you believe you should be investing in this phase of getting that project initiated? So as they're doing their answers, panelists, what's been your either experience, what's been your insights about in that early stages in order to get things greenlighted? Yeah.
So I can start. I think, do I push this together now?
No, I think
It is on,
Yep.
okay, good. I think one of the important roles of an executive sponsor is in identifying and removing barriers. So in that very early stage, one of the things that I like to do is hear from the folks who are closer to the business problems. What are those barriers, and what can I as an executive leader do to remove them? So sometimes it's procurement, sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's anticipating the need to hiring, which, I'm from my experiences at the federal level, not the state, but I believe that the hiring challenges are no less simple here than they are in Washington. So it's that sort of identify and remove barrier role that I think is particularly vital.
Great. Andrew?
Sure. I think that in terms of engaging early on in the project, while the initiation, the startup isn't necessarily the most difficult part of the project, it's a real opportunity to start building relationships with all of the key players on the project, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with these people. And as the project goes through the various phases, you're most likely going to experience difficulties and not necessarily have that kind of time to share vision and go through kind of relationship establishing exercises. So I think, just in terms of the removing barriers, getting to know people as well is going to be key in understanding what success looks like down the road.
I think as an executive sponsor, you need to be spending a lot of time up front, because the direction is coming from the top down, and you're painting the picture, you're painting the vision for everyone around you of what it's going to look like. Because as you know, you're shortly going to come at everyone around you asking for money. But you have to put the why first, and what it is that we're going to accomplish and why it's so desperately needed. And you need to talk to everybody and anybody. Again, we at the top are setting the direction. And if we think it's important and really can paint a picture and back it up with data and statistics and analytics, we'll bring everybody along on that journey.
Great.
I would second that and say that your need to display your personal commitment to this and let people know that you're leading this and espouse the importance of the project.
Great. And we know there's not one right answer, but in terms of the results, you all can't see this, but I will tell you, that we had the majority of people were at that sort of 25% or more of their time invested in this, even at this early stage. So you all have cited some of these things, but obviously there's a lot of things that sort of best practices would tell us are things that the executive sponsor should be doing. So it's being that owner that you all have talked about, making the business case, the why, as to why this is thing, looking for alignment with a strategic plan, getting the information out there. And so one question I wanted to throw at you all is that because people have been talking a little bit about governance. And at this early sort of initiation stage, what are some of your thoughts that your sort of things that you've experienced around starting to give thought to what that governance might look like, assuming the project gets greenlighted? Are there things that you found to be helpful?
You know, I think before you can even move into governance, you have to figure out who all the stakeholders are.
Okay.
So I'd say a predecessor to governance is doing a really thorough assessment of who are the stakeholders, and in some cases, they're really obvious. In my case, many of the projects that I led were government-wide projects, so the leaders in those customer organizations. But sometimes, you know, it's people who may be less obvious, and in the case of some of the kinds of projects that you all are leading, for instance, is there a union stakeholder that needs to be engaged, and how does that wrap into governance?
Yeah, in my experience too, governance is something that shifts over time. So the governance that you'll sort of approve in the initial contract will shift. And, you know, especially as people kind of go in and out of their roles. And so one of the strategies we've done is, right now we're engaged in an exercise to kind of do one amendment to the contract that points to a living project document that can be much more easily updated on a regular basis, because that's something that we're finding is a real need.
Governance for us, I think I alluded, I'm from the Employment Development Department. We're a very large department. We have 4 major programs. We have about 8,500 people statewide, so it's huge. We always have 4 or 5 projects going at any time. So probably about 5 years ago, we really worked on developing a methodology for project management, a very established discipline, all the way from the project sponsor down to the people doing the work. I sit on numerous steering committees. Some of them I'm the executive sponsor, and some are either the program deputy or the IT deputy, just depending on the impacts. So I will say that probably the biggest lesson that I've learned is that methodology, structured methodology in any department is crucial, because I go into every meeting, as well as my deputies, as well as the people that are work underneath us. We know what to expect. We know how projects work. We know what's coming next. We know where our decision points are. So if you don't have something like that in your department now, I highly recommend it.
So can I just add one point? I completely agree with you, although I would say that as you start changing how you're delivering projects and as you shift to Agile, you have to shift your project management and governance approach accordingly. So I think we'll get into that later, but keep in mind that how these roles are executed depends on the nature of the project. So that's a good thought to keep in your back pocket for later.
So we want to move things along a little bit. So sort of shift to the notion that you've gotten the green light. You're now migrating into that sort of project planning phase. So, you know, charter's been approved, and you've even gotten yourself a project manager assigned. I love the ambassador story where she kind of got there and there's nobody there, and we're going to assume that at least has happened. So one of the questions we'd love for you all as panelists to weigh in on is, in thinking about that executive sponsor project manager relationship. So as you've thought about that, what are the things that you either are looking for or maybe hoping for in sort of the who's coming forward and who's building that partnership with you from a project manager things? Are there things that you try to do in these early phases of that relationship with the project manager to tease out, is this going to be a good fit for me and for the project? Just kind of curious, are there things that you found to be particularly useful?
So I would say setting expectations really early, making sure that your project manager is somebody who you can count on, somebody who understands how you want the project managed. I personally don't want any surprises in my steering committee meeting. If you're going to come and tell me that we are now yellow and moving into red on something, I want to know beforehand, so I've had time to think about how we're going to mitigate this. Don't spring it on me in the meeting. And so the importance of that communication, it has to be the right person.
Great. Other things you found?
I would add too, the personality of the project manager is critical. I mean, there's sort of the nucleus in leading people, so they have to be able to bring people on a journey, and I never want to underestimate those people skills when you're selecting a project manager.
I'll underscore that. Our project manager is somebody who does have some people skills, and it really has made a critical difference.
Yeah.
And I would add that trust is a really important element, because you need to be able to empower that person with your trust, and you also have to have confidence that they can then earn the trust of the people who are on the project team. So assessing whether somebody is good at delegating, but sort of striking that balance between trust and empowerment and being trustworthy is critical.
So real specifically, because we got a lot of the people here who've never been executive sponsors, so is there a practical idea about how you either build, figure out whether someone's trustworthy, how you set those expectations? I mean, obviously, they're spending time with people. I'm just wondering if there's, someone said tips and tricks or whatever. Are there things that you found to be helpful in doing that really important work?
Well, so one thing I'd say, it sounds sort of obvious, but, just like you would check references on somebody you're going to hire, I would check with others who have worked with, or I always do check with others who have worked closely with that person. And that's not to say that you wouldn't want to bring somebody in as a project director who's never been one before, but you can tell by how they've performed in similar roles, whether they have that capacity, what their people skills are like, how do they perform as a manager. So I would check references up front before you get too far down the path to just validate your instincts and other evidence that you've compiled about that person.
Yeah, understanding the track record is really critical because most likely you're going to get the same kind of performance that that individual has executed on previous projects.
I was hoping for take them rock climbing or but that's those are great things. So one of the things, some of the kind of best practices that talking about, we've talked a little bit about governance structure and the project manager and getting them assigned and into building that good relationship. And then also again helping take the lead in building out the larger team. But some of you have talked a little bit about kind of communication, at a wider audience in terms of other stakeholders and kicking it off and sharing that vision. Are there things that you all have found, again, in that moving into that project planning before you're fully implementing, that you found to be helpful practices to engage that wider stakeholder group, either internally or externally?
I mean, once we've started.
No, this is, I think we're going to get to I'm going to hand it off to Brian here in a sec to talk about when things are actually up and running. But as you're building that project plan out, are there things that you found helpful? I heard the gentleman this morning talk about getting out of the getting out and engaging folks. I'm just wondering if there's things that you've done in particular that have been useful.
So one thing that, most of the work that I'm doing now is all agile, it's all user-centered, and doing that user research up front to understand who are the people who are going to benefit from this project. What do they expect? And not just asking them in a survey, because you'll get very different information if you go out and do interviews, or if you do even what we call in the world of user-centered design, doing ethnographic or qualitative research where you go out and you actually observe people. So we were doing a big project for a large agency that has something to do with airports. And we had somebody actually go to an airport and for 2 days just watch people, see how they interacted, and then interview people and understand if a project were to occur, or if a new system were to be fielded, what did they expect from it? Or observe somebody as they're using whatever it is that you're going to modernize to really understand what are the pain points that would warrant doing something different. So that to me is absolutely essential, because in the absence of that, you're building around either technology requirements or organization or policy or something other than what that user actually needs.
And I'll say at CalSTRS, we have 1,700 employers that report information to us about our members. And so one of our early strategies was to form we have what we call an employers forum, and they're bi-weekly calls. And so we've been doing this now for 2 years, just to kind of, with increasing frequency, to get a sense of what's acceptable, what's not, what their experience was with CalPERS, who recently went through a system upgrade. And then understand, as we're getting closer to what our new requirements are going to be and finalizing those, bringing them in on the front end, because we know that it's going to take a couple of years for them to implement the new system, and they're going to have to upgrade their systems to be able to interact with ours. So it's kind of doing that ahead of time has been very helpful.
I would add on to Brian's that a lot of projects aren't just IT projects, and you have lots of other pieces that you have to fit in, and we've had a project where we built a
an enormous biobank and freezers that in addition to the whole IT portion of it, there was building 70-foot-long freezers, procuring leased space to build the freezers in, and that timeline gets bigger and bigger, and you have to have that all spec'd out at the very beginning. So there's a lot more moving parts a lot of times than just the IT portion.
I would imagine that there's probably a little bit of this challenge about how to not get into the weeds, right? When you're in this executive sponsor role, and maybe some folks here had served as project managers, and now they're maybe being asked to executive sponsor role. And I would imagine in this project planning phase is where the suck, to draw you down into that weeds. Are there things that you found to be helpful as executive sponsors to kind of keep yourselves, up at the sort of appropriate level?
You just keep, it's one of those things you have to keep kicking yourself to say, ooh, step back, that's not my job anymore. I need to, and if you've set yourself up with good people below you, it's not so difficult. Sometimes it's really difficult because I know I could do it better than my project manager. Way better. Of course. But to step back and wait. And that's a challenge. I think probably for everybody in this room, because most people have probably come up through the ranks and they've incrementally gotten more and more responsibility, and that's hard.
I think it's also important to remind your project managers that it's okay for them to tell you to back off a bit.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So, and that's part of earning trust, saying, look, I don't mean to interfere, but I'm dying to help you. And to have them say, I've got it, just, you've got other things to do, trust me. So empowering people to tell you when you don't need to be involved is really, really valuable.
I would imagine in that, and again, you talked about setting the expectations up front. It's almost like that they've got your job description to remind you, like, hey, remember, you're supposed to be doing these things that were on this, nice bullet chart that you were given at that conference. So, you need to be working on those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to keep facilitating the next two phases here.